All right. It's 9:30. That was the time I was told to be here and start talking at your faces. And so that's what I'm going to do. This is modern versus old school. I like to subtitle this an AppSec journey. And it starts out from the perspective that security as an industry is lost. What is the new shiny? What is every other talk at this conference about right now? AI, right? And over the course of my career, I have seen many new shinies. Yes, I have gray hair for a reason. Half of this comes because I try to do security work and look at code all day long. I'm going to be honest. But this is my feeling. Security is lost. Doesn't mean that there aren't good things that are happening, but we are on this really strange path, a winding path to a secure environment and secure code in general. If I compare what we have nowadays to what we had back when I was getting into the industry, back at iOmega years and years and years ago, the zip drive people, everyone remembers the zip drive people, and yes, I was not responsible for the click of death. That was not me. If you lost data, take it up with, I don't know, EMC or whoever owns them now. Anyway, but if I look at what we had back in the, in that day, right, like this was the common understanding, or at least this is how we view it 20 years on, right? Like there was no security controls. Okay, maybe people had a username and a password. There was not understanding of all of these things that are security or what we consider to be security now. There were a lot of tooling deficiencies. We can't argue with that. And nowadays, hey, like especially in the AppSec space, right? Like we talk about pushing left. We've got the secure software development lifecycle. We've got security software that's in place. All of these frameworks, that keep us from introducing vulnerabilities into code. There's bug bounties, there's authentication, authorization, there's all of this that exists. And what I'm here to tell you is actually that perception of the industry back 20, 25 years ago is wrong. So why do I say that? First of all, we have to frame what application security is, what I'm talking about. I know there's people here that are probably in AppSec. There are people that are wider, that are responsible for more pillars within the security environment, right? Application security in general is just securing an app and its data against compromise. We call this application security. There's also product security, which is building the security into the products. Application security is typically looking at an application, its code, trying to identify vulnerabilities, and just figuring out how to secure this piece of software or this custom library or whatever it is that we've built against compromise for an organization. That's all application security is. So where did things go wrong? Like, why am I saying that we are lost and that our perception of security nowadays is wrong? I go all the way back to 1970, right? Now, this was before I was born, believe it or not. This was before I was born. But in 1970, the DoD came out with a report, the Security Controls for Computer Systems. It's also known as the WARE Report after one of the authors. It was a report to the Defense Science Board Task Force on Computer Security. You can go read this. It's still up on the DoD website, and it talks about security principles. We are moving too fast to consider that we know things better than they did back in the day. The recommendations that come out of this report are great to read, and I would argue have more relevance today than they did in 1970 when they came out with the report. But some of these things, right, the report calls out these most difficult security control situations, right? Time-sharing multi-access systems, geographically dispersed users, processing sensitive information. Now, what does this sound like? Is this just not the internet, right? Let's be honest, time-sharing systems, this is everybody accessing the same like websites, applications, whatever it is that's online, geographically dispersed, Amazon, AWS, anyone, right? Like we're all over the world at this point, and we process sensitive information. We send data from Europe to the the United States to Asia and back and forth, and we're processing financial transactions all across the world. This is incredibly relevant to what we're trying to protect today. The vulnerabilities that they call out in the WARE report: accidental disclosure, breach data, anyone, breaches, deliberate penetration, so exploitation, active infiltration, passive subversion, physical attacks. These are all the same things that we bring up in our threat models nowadays. And this diagram that I've got here is directly from the WARE report. Does this not look like a threat model that we do nowadays, right? Yeah, we probably don't go down to the processor level and all of this, but we have all of the same sorts of things. I should put this up, the Star Wars threat modeling talk yesterday, right? Like that could fit right in here because it's exactly the same sort of analysis. And they were doing this before they had systems that were that were as expansive as, that were not as expansive as they are today. Yeah, like assets, threat actors, everything else is in this network vulnerability diagram. But some of the conclusions that came out of it, I'm not going to force you to read both of these, right? Software safeguards alone are not sufficient. This is what I start to pull out as an application security person, right? Like security has a whole realm of different controls that need to be in place, and everything from physical security, network security, to application security. This last statement here, though, I love, is it is unwise to incorporate classified or sensitive information in a system functioning in an open environment unless a significant risk of accidental disclosure can be accepted. And again, I want to highlight that. A significant risk of accidental disclosure can be accepted. A lot of times we just willy-nilly put everything out online and don't realize the amount of risk that we are accepting. But they monitor my credit now, so it's good, right? Like, we're okay, although my data is out there. But it is a design problem. That's the other thing I wanted to highlight here. Providing these controls in a computer system is primarily a design problem. Yes, we spend a lot of time talking about implementation and developing controls, but in a nutshell, it's a design problem that we have in how we put together these systems. All right, so that's the WARE report. That's a long time ago. I'm going to walk through some comparisons of what I've seen over the years, right? As far as like pre-internet days to now, and what actually happened and why those controls exist, and why I say that we are lost because we see the same problems show up over and over. So I'm going to go all the way back. Now I'm actually alive, right? Like, this is August 25th, 1992, roughly, right? I'm going into high school at this time. There is a system that exists in Utah back in the day. It's called Parent Link. And this was the software that school districts used to notify parents that their son or daughter had missed a class. It would also send out announcements and notifications, but it would actually had a list of phone numbers. It would call out and tell you, at 4 o'clock, whatever, every day that, hey, your son or daughter missed a class today. All right, that's interesting. It also allowed you to call in and get whatever announcements were there and were listed by the school that was associated with it. So what we have is a phone system with anonymous access, because this is before there was any sort of caller ID or anything, and it allowed for user input, right? Like, I can call in and I can actually push buttons, right? Like, it says, press 1 for announcements. You press 1, you get those. I can't remember what 2 or 3 was, but I know after we played a little bit that 8 repeated the menu, and 0, or the star key, sorry, I was off. Star key, please enter the administrator passcode. Sweet. All right, so I don't know what this system can do, but we have a phone system. We put in 1, 2, 3, 4, and it says, oh, sorry, try again, right? Okay, 0, 0, 0, 0, sorry, try again. But it's only 4 digits long, and again, I'm like 14, 15 years old. I can't drive yet. I got a couple of friends. We have nothing but time on our hands. So we make a list. There's 4 of us. We pass it out. Everybody starts in, 0000, and it just, after 3 tries, it hangs up on us. We have to dial back in. That was frustrating. But, once we hit 5642, it allows us into an administrator dashboard, right? And of course, we should have guessed this because it was Logan City Schools. That's where I grew up, LOGA. Yeah. Anyway, the next time we were smarter about it, but yeah, whatever. All right. So now we can add announcements. Okay, that's probably not something that we want to do. We can reset the administrator passcode, of course, right? Make sure that we have access to it in the future, and we can restart the system. Now, this doesn't do us really any good unless we can get the system not to call our parents when we skip class, because that's the whole point of us getting into this. But we realized that if we restart the system after the secretaries load in the daily attendance charts, those charts are actually stored in memory, in RAM. And what happens to RAM when you restart a system? Yep. And so the absences were loaded about 3:25 after school. Memory not on disk, and with that we used this for the next 3 years as I was in high school. Every time that we would skip class, we would just reset the system. They did change the password on a yearly basis, so we had to run through our brute forcing attack here and there. But it was a great introduction. Now at this point, we were getting into things like, we had heard of Captain Crunch and Freaking and other things like that, so we thought we were hot stuff at that point, right? But it was incredibly useful. Now most of the time, we were skipping class to go to the planetarium or something like that, and yes, okay, yeah, but whatever, right? Password brute force, right? That's basically what we're going through here. This is the same thing that we deal with today as far as credential stuffing goes. You've probably seen these sorts of attacks against your applications, all the breach data that's out there. I mean, yes, it becomes more difficult. We don't see a lot of 4 digits that happen in things over time anymore, but it's incredibly easy to do, right? We've got password lists. We know what the most common passwords are from all of the breach data. We can put things into place like anti-automation and other things, but authentication is a really hard problem to solve, and we really haven't gotten that much better. Yes, there are specific applications, there are specific organizations that do it better, but across the board, right? I look, as a third-party consultant, I look at a lot of software and a lot of new software that's coming up from startups, and this is we struggle. That's all I can say is we struggle because we find authentication flaws in 90% of the applications that we test. It's not always the credential stuffing, brute forcing, but it is authentication issues. Here's a simple example. This is from a recent test that we did where an account had to be preloaded by an administrator, right? So you were assigned a username and a password. Once you log in the first time, and it would have you reset the password. The problem that we found is that the form that was used for registration or logging in for the first time as a user also would accept accounts that had already been registered with the system. So on the left-hand side, you'll notice, right, okay, there's this SLAW 6 test account that I'm playing with, and it tells me, hey, I've already registered my identity. But on the right-hand side here, the user ID and password combination you entered doesn't match any entries in this database. Right? Okay, so what did that just tell me? Huh? Enumeration, but it's not enumeration of the username, it's enumeration of the password. Yep. And this is, like I said, it's incredibly common, right? We always think about the login form when we're trying to protect an application from authentication attacks, and we often forget things like registration and other places, password reset. That's where we find most of our flaws nowadays. And then once you can figure this out, all bets are off, and you've got, account takeover. Okay, so let's go back. We're moving up a little bit in time now. Does anyone know the significance of this date, January 1st, 1993? Was anybody in Utah in January 1st, 1993? Was anybody doing, let me see, any phreaking or war dialing at this time? Star 69. This is the day that Star 69 and caller ID went into effect, and US West, Quest, whatever it was back then, actually implemented the callback system. Okay, now again, right, this is 6 months or so after we were starting to get into the war dialing scene, living up in Logan, Utah, and what are we doing with our modems at that time? We are scanning the entire POTS network, looking for BBSs and ARPANET access points, because they had all of those up at the university. We needed to know where they were so we could actually connect to the precursor to the internet, right? And so we would use things like iWAR to actually scan the network looking for all of these systems. And we would find really interesting things. I mean, fax machines, right? That was a big thing back in the day. People that set up their own little BBSs, and we'd argue with them because they didn't know who we were, and we were connecting and trying to, list all of their files or what have you. We'd find voicemail boxes, long distance call services. These became interesting. There was a lot of companies that would set up these boxes where you would call in, enter in a code, and then you could make long distance calls. I mean, we don't necessarily deal with this as much anymore, but when we live up in Logan, Utah, it's hard to dial, a BBS in Connecticut to actually connect and download, whatever latest crack, they have from a game. But if you can find a long distance call service, that is a way to get around that. Or you can go through the ARPANET entry points and dial out a university modem that happens to be at the University of Connecticut, right? Like, there's other ways to get at this. But this is an example, again, of an enumeration attack, right? Like, it's not quite brute forcing, but it is an example of an enumeration or a forced browsing attack, as we like to talk about it. Like, there's a level of broken access control on all of these systems because we can enumerate what's going on. If we look at broken access control nowadays, again, like I talk about authentication failures, that's probably the number one item we find in applications. Broken access control has got to be up there right next to it, right? The ability to get access to functionality, data, endpoints that is sensitive and that we should not have access to. These are the vulnerabilities as they're listed out. Oftentimes it's just security through obscurity. And that's what we had back in the day, is very, that whole POTS network, the only place where we could go get phone numbers for businesses or whatever was the phone book. And that left out a lot of space that you could hide things in. Nowadays, it's not, it's not as easy nowadays. Anybody ever stand up a new device on the internet? How long does that take to get scanned? Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's within minutes, right? And with the new AI agentic tools as well, those are being exploited even faster, and data is being dumped out of them very, very quickly. And a lot of this is really, you're just driving around that gate that happens to exist in one place, right? It's, common theme that we see. This is a recent test that we did. This vendor in particular protected, it's a multi-tenant system. They protect the tenants from each other by using a 3-letter code, right? So basically, you can get to one tenant's data through, CAT at the beginning, or you could get to another one through NEL. And that was the only protection that existed in between, like, this division. I mean, this is, obviously, a pretty poor design. And when it came down to it, it was just like, this is so easy to bypass from an automated perspective, right? 3-letter codes. There's only 18,000 combinations. This took us all of 10, 15 seconds to run through this with 100 threads on Burp. And we had figured out, okay, these are the existing customers, number one, but this is data that's available to us within this environment that we can get at. They've since protected and actually moved to like a GUID-based system and actually implemented proper controls around that data, so you can't access it unless you happen to be within the NEL group or whatever else it is. But again, an access control issue, access control violations. All right, so now we actually move into my career as it has existed. July 15th, 2001. Anyone serving in the precursors to SOC during these days. I don't think we really had SOCs in the sense that we do nowadays. I was at iOmega, right? We were, helping like roll things out. Now, early days of the internet, most of the organizations that were on the internet, they had full access. Like they would request IP addresses from ICANN and would get huge blocks. So iOmega specifically had a Class B assigned to them, a full Class B. Nowadays, like they would never give a company of that size a full Class B, but they were early precursors on the internet. And so they handed out all of those IP addresses to systems that were online, right? Including all of their manufacturing systems, Novell NetWare, old Windows NT boxes that were actually building or controlling the engineering equipment that was building the zip drives and the Jazz drives at that point. But on July 15th, 2001, there was this little thing that went around that was called Code Red. And any system that could be connected to over port, I'm trying to remember, I think this is 3389, could be compromised. And of course, all of these systems that were online and accessible from the internet in general caused a huge outage at iOmega. And this was actually the formation of the iOmega security team, because up to this point, they didn't even have budget for a firewall, right? Since everything was online. And so we had to do this whole rollback of, okay, how do we get rid of Code Red? How do we actually clean the systems? They had to take all of the manufacturing offline. And it became this just like, it was a massive, massive effort, cost millions of dollars for them to clean up. Now, it doesn't mean that this wasn't what caused them to go out of business. That was CDs, right? Like we all know that. But it was a good introduction into the new shiny, right? Okay, there's firewalls in place. We're going to form a security team. We're going to put up a firewall, and we're going to never have a problem again. And this kind of feeds into this expectation and like what we like to call this peak of inflated expectations. This is my first experience with it, where there's a technological trigger, there's an incident that happens in the security industry. We decide, hey, guess what? Like I have new AI, and now I need some sort of AI firewall that we put into place, right? And that's going to stop all of the attacks from happening. And we roll it out very quickly. I've seen this happen with, web application firewalls, multiple different static analysis tools, everything that's out there. So you have all these inflated expectations. It was only a year or two later that they actually were hit by NIMDA as well, right? Like Code Red, that was the other one that went around. But peak of inflated expectations that we realized that the firewall couldn't do everything. And so we got into this trough of disillusionment, like we have to do other things. And then we start to figure out how to really utilize these tools. As quickly as we can get from the technology trigger to this plateau of productivity, the better off we're going to be. Okay. So this is an example of insecure design, right? We just had no idea that the firewall was, this is going to be a problem, but we should have at least protected a little bit, used some sort of NAT or something else back in the day to protect those systems that were sensitive, but our networking team had just decided to lay it all out on the internet. Which brings us forward a little bit further, right? So this is only a couple of years ago, 2021. Where was everybody in 2021? You remember? Yeah, at home. There we go. Yep. We were all at home. We had been home for a year and a half, pretty much at this point. Things were starting to open back up. And one of the things that also was opening up on this day was passes to Disneyland, right? Like they'd done away with their season passes. Of course, at this point, I have a couple of kids. And these Magic Key, this is their new season pass system that they were going to implement. And my wife wanted to get it because, yes, we've been stuck at home for 18 months and would like to actually go to Disneyland. Okay, that's great, but they're releasing it all at the same time online, and there is huge demand for these season passes. Okay, right? Like that means that's fine. We log in, we go to the site itself. We're like, all right, let's see if we can actually get these before they sell out. Whatever happens, right? And when you go to the site, this is what you see on the left-hand side. Thank you for your continued patience. I'm not sure how well you can see that. It says don't refresh the page or you're going to lose your spot in line. And an approximate wait time is more than an hour. So I'm sitting at my computer on August 25th watching this spinner just go, and the page reloads every so often. And since it's doing that, I load up Burp at the same time because I want to see what's going on. Burp is a proxy. I can see the traffic as it goes back and forth. And on the left-hand side, this is the response that's coming back from the server. I'll blow it up here. You'll see there's a queue state that's in there. There is a queue number, queue pause. There's also this last updated UTC. Right? Like, so the last time that I actually made a call to see where I was in line, and you'll see that that's at, August 25th, it's at like 9:28, it's a UTC code, all right, whatever. But the expected service time here is August 26th at 9:47. It's like 12 plus hours later, right? I'm like, this is untenable. I don't want to do this, right? Like, I'm not going to sit here. I'm not going to set my alarm to wake up in the middle of the night to actually get these tickets. So is there anything that we can take advantage of? Now, what I notice as I'm looking at the wait page is this little field down at the very bottom of the page. It says queue ID, right? Oh, so they've given us a GUID value. This is the queue that I'm in. And it's associated with, it doesn't show up in this response here, but it's actually being sent as a cookie value to the API to get this response back. Okay, that's probably something I can work with, especially in a situation where we have hundreds, if not thousands of people using the same queuing system, a lot of them stuck in line, staring at a screen that says it's going to be more than an hour before they can actually get tickets. Now, what do we know about people that have been sitting at home for 18 months and don't have anything else to do when there's a problem? Where do they go? To Twitter. They go and complain about it. And not only that, but they take pictures of their screen about what they're actually seeing. So I go on Twitter, I do a search for hashtag magic key, and I get back things like, oh, look, like they're coming soon. Here, look, like thanks for your interest in purchasing. It will be open soon. But you'll notice that there's multiple of these that they've taken pictures with their iPhone and it's showing QID down at the bottom. So I just gather a couple of those. We pop it into our cookie value, and voila, 9 minutes later, I've actually purchased tickets. Now, we weren't monsters. Like, we still paid for them. It was, we just happened to jump the line by a few tens of thousands of people. That's fine, right? And it worked pretty well. This is a modern business logic flaw, right? This is, insecure direct object reference is what we like to call it, or broken object level access. It would be very easy for Disney to actually store this value in a session object or something else that is not associated with the user, but they're also trusting the user to actually give this data to them in order to respond with, where they're at in that queuing system, right? One of the reasons that I have all of this actually documented is we knew one of the security architects at Disney at that time, and I sent him a whole report and they actually fixed it, but the only thing that they did to fix it was they removed this little the QID from the screen, right? I'm like, yeah, that's enough. People don't need to know what that is. If they really need to pull it up, there's mechanisms that you can do that with from a support perspective. So there's a lot of things that we can do, but it's the same sort of we're getting access to functionality that we shouldn't have access to. So why do these issues still exist? We knew about them in 1970. People have been exploiting these since the 80s and 90s. We've had problems with Captain Crunch and phreaking and all of this as the industry has matured. You'd think that we would get better at it. Part of this is a cat and mouse game. But realistically, it's just this security design problem that we have, that we're trying to implement security after we find a technology, after something new has come about. And I'm not saying that it's every organization, right? But there are a large portion of organizations that have problems with this. Not everybody is Elastic, right? That was up talking, yesterday. Not everyone is Netflix that puts in the time and the effort to this. The large companies do, but they also have large teams. So we've got to figure out a way that we can get to the same level without the resources that they have. Part of the problem here, though, from a modern perspective, is we have this, like, I was talking about the new shiny, right? Security we view as a point solution. We're not thinking about it holistically. We measure things and we go about security by measuring point systems, right? Does anybody have access to or has used like WP Engine, for example? I'm going to pick on them for a little bit, right? Like a lot of WordPress sites are hosted at either WordPress.com or WP Engine. WP Engine sends you a weekly email, or all of their administrators a weekly email, telling them of the billions of attacks that they have prevented against their sites every week. Which is, it's a great stat to include in a marketing email to your customer base, but it really has nothing to do with security. Right? How many of those are those just generic, like, Nmap scans of people scanning the internet at large? Like, it's not actually attacks that are occurring specific to those organizations. And all we're doing is giving people a false sense of security, right? They're saying that, hey, we've got you because we prevented all this, but you happen to have, like this, whatever plugin that's out of, it's 10 revisions out of date, has a known exploit against it, and somebody's already taken over your account, right? Like that is the problem that I see with those sorts of measurements that we send out there. Like a lot of these are good indicators of how well your security team is doing, but we have a tendency to give them to customers and other people as a security blanket when in fact they are not. Another problem that we run into is developer education. Security is either not taught or teaching is insufficient. I had this problem when I went through school. Yes, it was years and years ago, but I took a computer security course in my computer science curriculum, and the only thing that we talked about were S-boxes and how to actually do encryption. We didn't talk about real security issues. We've gotten better at this, but with the advent of cybersecurity programs, information security programs, and some of the other avenues that we teach about security, but in general, we do a pretty poor job of teaching developers about security. This is one of the first things that if you're building a security program for an organization, this is the way to address it, is getting the developer excited about security. Recommendations that come out of tools are too generic or too specific. When was the last time you saw a recommendation for, say, like a SQL injection vulnerability? Has anybody seen one of those? Yeah, typically it is the recommendation that comes out of the tools is do better, right? And we see this a lot too with CVEs, right? Like there's not enough detail in there, so it's like, go patch your system. All right, is this really an exploitable vulnerability for our organization? Do we know what that actually is? What is the approach that we should actually take there? So it's either too specific or it's too generic. And we know that you should fix SQL injection, and this is how you do it in a Java Spring application. And yeah, but I'm running, Python Django. That's not helpful to me. And so we have this issue that we just keep running into over and over, that developer education is lacking. Conflicting advice. Right? Anybody ever ask ChatGPT how to, secure a system? Or do you actually know where ChatGPT is getting that information from? What it's trained on? These LLMs are typically trained on data that may be 18 months, 2 years out of date. And then they hallucinate, right? There's ways to get around this, and if you go to some of the talks on agentic AI and use reflection and real prompt engineering, you can account for these problems. But in general, most people and most developers are just going to tab their way through that GitHub Copilot. Hey, build me a call to the database, right? And if it pulled one of the answers that happened to be SQL injection related or vulnerable to SQL injection, it's probably going to end up there. Yep, what works in one language doesn't apply in the next. I think I talked about that. Final thing here, if your employer doesn't take security seriously, why should you? This has become a major issue for us as a third party walking into organizations, trying to help them build application security programs. The fact that upper management is give lip service to security, but they're not willing to train their developers on actual security coding techniques for their specific language and framework and platform that exists. Or they'll go out and buy a static analysis tool that'll identify vulnerabilities and not pay for actual labor or somebody to go in and run that tool. It's really easy to go buy the new shiny, but it's a lot harder to support that and get to the level of productivity that we need to secure things. From a security tooling perspective, security often provides the wrong tool for a development environment. If your security tools are out of band, if it's not part of the DevSecOps process, the likelihood that vulnerabilities are going to get fixed by the developers goes down significantly. Right? If it's not in their face, in the environment that they work with, it's actually not going to be super helpful. I mean, we're the same way, right? If I'm actually looking at a SIM tool, if I have to go log into, Qualys or something to actually get the vulnerability report, the likelihood that I'm going to do that and then pull that into Jira or my ticketing system is pretty low. We've got to figure that integration. That's one of the reasons yesterday I really loved that Elastic talk. The way that they're actually automating that flow across an organization and surfacing it in Slack for people to interact with and developers and other things is ingenious. That's how security will happen in any organization. Identification does not equal remediation. Just because we found a problem doesn't mean it actually gets fixed, and there's no magic bullet here. We've got to do the hard work. That's what we're all here for. That's what we're trying to do. And this goes to working with people across the organization, right? So whether that is operations, development, QA, like we have, every organization calls people a little bit different, and they have different names for various roles. But unless you're talking with the whole organization about security, you're probably missing some key component. Security support, developers in general, if you ask them what their initial experience with security is, it's usually that security told them no, they couldn't do something that they needed to do for their job. And it's usually negative in that first case. Right? We do a poor job of explaining why this is a problem, why it needs to be fixed. And it's usually because we're inundated with hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of vulnerabilities and issues that we're trying to solve. And we don't necessarily want to take the time to explain it. It's just, I like to call it vulnerability fatigue. Because that's really what we run into. We have to prioritize our list of vulnerabilities, and when a developer questions what that actually is, we run into this, this problem and this conflict that really shouldn't exist. One of the issues that we often see is here's this code base from 1998-9 that's been given to a new developer that just came onto the team, and 2 months later you're like, oh my word, it's vulnerable to SQL injection. How could you actually push this out to production? And they're like, I've been here for 8 weeks. I still can't build this in my development environment. How are you asking me to solve these problems when I haven't had the time and I haven't been given the leeway to go and actually fix those problems? Developers usually don't get to choose what they're working on in today's environments. They are told by product managers, by upper management, that this is the feature that you need to go create. And if security is not in that discussion, the security vulnerabilities aren't going to get fixed. So this goes back to the WARE report. Again, providing satisfactory security controls in a computer system is in itself a design problem. We need to be talking to the right people to do this. I know I've been pretty down on what's going on, but all hope is not lost. Good things are happening. OWASP top 10 now with actual risks. From an OWASP perspective, they've gotten better about identifying actually the root cause of vulnerabilities as opposed to, hey, here's cross-site scripting and we're going to call out the exploit itself and what's actually going on, right? The OWASP top 10 for LLMs is like this as well, right? We talked about prompt engineering and other things to actually alleviate the problems that exist there. Threat modeling, the rise of threat modeling has been amazing to see. Within the last just 5 years, the number of people that actually know what threat modeling is, that they're talking about design issues for platforms, for software, early on in the development lifecycle is amazing, right? We've made it a lot more approachable. If you look at the RRA from Mozilla, right? Like the rapid risk assessment, or even approaches like the Star Wars approach, like understanding how to do a threat model and understanding that it can be effective even in small discussions is great to see. We build security into products, right? Like the biggest, one of the initial innovators in this space was Netflix, how they actually like paved path, the whole idea of, hey, we've got this paved path for developers. If they do things in a certain way, then they can actually develop faster because we won't get in their way. Security gets out of the way when you do the right thing. And then DevSecOps, like the ability to actually integrate these tools into our development pipelines is a great thing. But what can you do, right? Build relationships. Security is a design problem, but building security is actually a people problem. And yes, part of the problem is the people that actually still give their creds and click on links and emails, and like we have those issues. But internal to an organization, if you want to fix security problems, you have to have relationships with the people that are building things, right? Typically, security is a cost center. It costs money to actually run a security team, and they don't bring money in. So we've got to figure out ways to help the people that are actually building the products, building the features that bring money into the company. But no, really, what can you do? Remember, right? Security is a journey, not a destination. There is no point solution. So you've got to come up with a repeatable approach to secure systems and figure out a way to make life easier for everyone that's trying to build these products, right? Look for those that support security and are excited about it. Especially in the development organization, we always talk about security champions, the guys that are slinging that code. If you can get them on board, it's going to be a lot easier to actually push that through. Learn from the past, right? Like when a mistake happens, don't blame the guy that wrote that code. Actually, remember that they've learned an expensive lesson, and let's trust them to actually do the right thing. No developer I've ever talked to has said that they want to develop insecure code. Right? They don't want their application to be exploited. They would rather build it securely. So learn from those past examples. And go read the WARE Report. Right? I like to encourage people to do this, but this is a great resource, and actually is still very much relevant in today's world. Access control throughout the system, file classification, input, output, validation limitations. System certifications, right, for DoD, for FedRAMP, whatever it happens to be. This is where it all started, and it's good to understand our roots where we got these ideas. The guys that designed these, or I shouldn't say guys, but the team that developed these systems back in the 60s and 70s thought a lot about security. And we threw a lot of it out as we went to open systems, and the industry just grew very, very quickly, but it doesn't mean that this is not still relevant and we can't still use these principles in our daily lives. Finally, security is hard, try harder. Right? We can do this. We've seen a lot of organizations make great strides along these paths. So keep at it. You're doing a great job. And with that, that's all I've got today. This is where you can find me. I'm at Seth Law on pretty much every out there. Find me on LinkedIn, find me on X, find me on Instagram, whatever it is. I also do a podcast with a friend, Ken Johnson, who runs a startup that's doing AI, a SaaS tool basically, but it's Absolute AppSec. We're 300 episodes in, something like that. So it's been it's been quite a while. It's been good. Anyway, that's it. That's everything that I've got. Questions? All right. Well, thanks for having me. Yeah. Appreciate it.